Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Endgame video. I'm recording this from the beautiful city of Toronto, Canada, where I will be covering the Chess.com Global Chess Championship, something I'm incredibly excited about. And for this reason, as you've probably already noticed, the video and mainly the audio quality is not what it usually is. That's because I don't have any of my regular streaming and recording equipment. I'm just doing this straight up from my laptop. And originally, I wasn't planning to do any content while in Toronto, but I just passed Hikaru Nakamura in the lobby of the hotel. I feel so motivated, staying in a new and really cool city and a cool hotel. And I'm just in the mood to do some chess, especially because I've assembled all of the material already for this next Endgame video. So first and foremost, I ask for your understanding and your forgiveness. Hopefully the audio will be bearable. I'm trying to talk a little bit more quietly to avoid triggering any peaking or any weird noises. So this is a particularly exciting video because in this and the following video, you will have the opportunity to put everything that you have learned over the past 5 Pawn Endgame videos to the test. You will have the opportunity to solve 10 really cool exercises that cover virtually all of the concepts and themes and ideas that we have talked through over the past few videos, whether it's opposition or Zugzwang or understanding and using passed pawns, playing against them, pawn breakthroughs, literally everything that we have covered. I have tried to choose 10 examples that help you review those concepts, but also to nuance your understanding of them and see how they are applied by strong players in the wild. So before we jump in, a couple of words on how I recommend that you approach this in the following video. In the description, there will be 2 PGN files. The first will contain the puzzles themselves, and the second will contain the puzzles plus the solutions 5 at a time. So if you sort of want to do this like a professional, then I would suggest that you download the file containing the puzzles. You try to solve them on your own. You spend as long as you want. There's no recommended time limits. As long as you need to do your very best, try to propose solutions for each of them, do what you can, and then watch this video carefully where I will go through each of these positions in great detail. I will not only walk you through the solution itself, but also try to help you understand how a deep knowledge of the concepts that we have gone over in the last couple of videos should have helped you arrive at the solution. So if you watch that, you can also download the file containing the solutions. And I have tried to be as detailed as possible in that file in case you don't want to watch the video, or you want a TLDR, or you want something that can help you review. Obviously, you're under no obligation to treat this as a test. If you just want to chill and watch this video and you don't want to do any solving, that is perfectly fine. That is totally acceptable. And I hope that this video can also function as kind of a standalone instructional overview of all of these concepts. And so whether you have already downloaded the puzzle file and you have taken a stab at these 5 puzzles, or whether, as Agenmater says, you're just along for the ride, let's jump into these positions. Let's talk all about them, and let's get this thing underway. Okay, so I'm going to switch scenes here. Okay, and I'm also going to enable a little part of a Word document that will hopefully contain some useful information that you can rely on and use. As I'm explaining the solutions. There we go. And I'm going to do what I usually do when we transition from one puzzle to the next. I'm going to switch that text box on the bottom. So that text box just contains sort of overarching themes of each exercise, as well as a couple of tips that stem from the correct solution. It's really just for reference. It's not exhaustive, but hopefully that helps you out a little bit. So before we actually jump in, I will say that these exercises and positions were supposed to be challenging. If you tried your best and you're saying to yourself, man, I couldn't solve any of them, I feel like I haven't learned any of these concepts properly, don't feel that way. Don't feel that not getting the solutions in their entirety means that you have not appreciated the concepts or you've not listened attentively to the previous videos. These are meant to be incredibly challenging, and some of them very strong players did not find the correct solution in full or even in part. And so this is really meant not just as a kind of rote exercise where you just kind of parrot the concepts, that's kind of boring. This is also meant, as I said at the start, to really nuance your understanding, to help you deepen your conception of these concepts and the way that they play a role in especially complicated and juicy pawn endgames. And above all else, I hope that you actually enjoy these examples. I hope that you're able to appreciate the beauty in them, because at the end of the day, why are we doing this if it's not out of an appreciation for how beautiful endgames, especially pawn endgames, can be? Okay. And finally, we're ready. So in our first example, white is none other than the world champion, Jose Raul Capablanca, and he is playing a simultaneous exhibition game against a totally unknown player. And this totally unknown player, Tuckerman, has basically been neck and neck the entire game against Capablanca. It was a close game, and they reach the position that's on the board in front of you with black to move. Now, you might first wonder, okay, is this some sort of a typo? Is this the position I intended to give? Because there are rooks on the board, and I'm supposed to be helping you review pawn endgames. Well, it's not quite a typo. I did intend to give this position because the first thing that you should notice after looking at the board for a couple of seconds is that the white king and the white rook are aligned on the same rank. And with the move rook b6, black can actually force the rooks off of the board, leading to a very exciting pawn race and an incredible long series of forced moves. So the first move is rook b6. And just jumping ahead a little bit, when you have a rook endgame and you have the possibility to exchange rooks, you should always start by calculating, or at least trying to calculate, the pawn endgame, because as a rule, pawn endgames are more forcing and they're easier to calculate than rook endgames. So it's worth starting by assessing the liquidation, the transformation into the pawn endgame. Now, rook b6 forces white to take. There's simply no other move, otherwise white loses the rook. So Capablanca captures on b6, and black proceeds by recapturing. Now we have a traditional pawn race. Clearly, white cannot stop the c-pawn, so white has to push his only passed pawn that has a direct path to promotion, and we just get a no-frills regular pawn race. Hopefully you were able to calculate up to this point: c3, e6, c2, e7. And if you feel hazy on how to assess pawn races, then this is where you might want to rewatch that video on pawn races that contain the 5 rules that are supposed to help you evaluate them. Now, one of the rules says that just because both sides promote to a queen at the same time, let's say black promotes and then white promotes, it doesn't automatically mean that the game just ends in a draw. And you absolutely have to check whether you can win your opponent's queen, often via a skewer. We'll actually see an example of that later on. But the other thing that people often forget to check for is whether the queens can be exchanged, which once again gets the game into a pawn endgame. And in that resulting pawn endgame, it sometimes just so happens that your opponent's king is going to be poorly placed. And for example, you can create another passed pawn while your opponent has exhausted that ability. And kudos to you if you didn't stop calculating here and just assume that the position was a draw. Another round of kudos if you didn't fall for the temptation to give a check on b2 and say, hey, let me win this pawn on a2. Well, the problem with that move is that white can cover with the queen. If you take on a2, you actually get checkmated after queen e7 and queen g7 and queen g5. But what Tuckerman was able to spot is that the white king and the white queen are on adjacent files, and the white king is also confined by its counterpart. It can't really go anywhere on the g file, and there is a way for black to force the exchange of queens. It starts with queen f4 check, driving the king onto the e file. Doesn't matter where it goes. And it also doesn't matter where on the e file the black queen jumps to. For example, queen e4 check in the game, black played queen e5 check. Capablanca had to step aside. And after the queen trade, we get a very interesting situation. Black has a 2-on-1 on the queen side, and white's king could not possibly be in a worse place. It is as far away from the pawns as possible. In the meantime, black's king fully contains white's pawn. And yet another round of kudos to you if you were successfully able to determine that black is able to promote to another queen on the queen side. White's king is not fast enough. The way you do it is you apply the PPP rule. You push the prospective passer. The prospective passer is the b pawn. This is more accurate than playing a4. Here, white can deep freeze the pawns with a3. Black still wins via a breakthrough, but it's good form to play b5. Capablanca rushes his king back desperately. But after b4, king c6, a4, black wins this tempo for tempo. King b5, b3, and at least one of black's pawns is going to promote to a queen. Shockingly, Capablanca played on for actually for 10 moves. I mean, he must have been upset. This is a simul game. But what amazing calculational effort by his unknown opponent. And unsurprisingly, Tuckerman was able to convert the full extra queen. And so to summarize this first example, first and foremost, consider liquidation, consider the exchange of rooks. If you have a rook endgame, then that incredibly important rule of pawn races, if both sides promote simultaneously, you can't stop calculating. You have to consider whether you can win your opponent's queen or whether you can exchange the queens, and then in the resulting position, let's say, promote to another queen, which is exactly what happens here. Okay, on we go to our second example. And our second example is another old game. It's a game of Akiba Rubinstein, who made an appearance in the previous video. He's facing off against Paul Leonhardt, who is a very, very strong player. This game was played, I think, in the early 1900s. And let me change up the little text box here. Okay, do what I usually do, super high tech, I know. All right, there we go. Okay, so it is white to play, and it shouldn't take you too long to determine that white is the one playing for a win. How do I know that? Well, white's king is just a lot more active, right? It's further advanced down the board. And another thing that you might notice is that it's a weird situation where both sides are kind of deep freezing the other, right? White's deep freezing black's pawn majority with this pawn on b4 is a classic deep freeze. And in a way, black is also deep freezing white's pawn majority. Like, white can't easily create a passed pawn on the king side. So it would be very forgivable to assume that this game should just end in a draw because neither side can make progress. But that's not true because white's king is in such a better place as opposed to its counterpart. So the first thing that should come to mind for you is, well, why don't we just take a dive take a dive or a drive, however you want to put it. Let's go to the queen side. Let's eliminate black's pawns, and then let's promote our b pawn. And so the move king d6 is indeed very tempting. But here you have to calculate the pawn race. Black will do exactly the same thing on the king side, and black's king is actually very well positioned to quickly and securely eliminate white's pawns, paving the way for the path of this h-pawn. And if you go down this line, king c6, king g5, there's no art to this. You just have to brute force your way down these pawn races. King takes g4, king takes a6. Now, important rule, do not capture unnecessary pawns. It turns out that you can take either pawn of black, but really the clinical move is king takes h5, white takes on b5, black steps away with his king, white does exactly the same, and as you can determine pretty easily, both sides promote at the same time, and you, as a student of pawn endgame, would quickly check to see whether white doesn't have any skewers. He doesn't. There's absolutely nothing, and in fact, it is white who is kind of suffering here because white's probably going to lose that f-pawn and could potentially even risk losing the game. So, well, that's kind of disappointing. The direct brute force attempt at a pawn race doesn't result in success. And this is where you would also be forgiven for just assuming that white's king therefore has to just kind of step back. But let's not forget a very important technique from our video on advanced concepts in pawn endgames. And I called this moving your opponent's pawns. And what that referred to is a sacrifice, a strategic sacrifice that is intended to change the pawn structure in a way that is favorable to you. Now, what does it mean to change? Why would a change in pawn structure be favorable to you? Well, there could be a lot of reasons, right? It could have to do with blazing a path for your king, but one of the most legitimate reasons for sacrificing is to extend the time that it takes for your opponent to create a passed pawn. So if you're anticipating a pawn race, a very well-timed sacrifice could force your opponent to spend that one extra tempo to take all of your pawns. And as you guys know by now, one extra tempo is often the difference between life and death in a pawn race. Now, what is the path that the black king can take to capture white's pawns? Well, the only path is through f6 and g5. And so the brilliant, correct first move is to advance the pawn to f6, forcing black's g-pawn onto f6 and blocking the path of black's king. But that's not all, because here, the temptation, of course, is to play king d6. You might also notice that there is what seems to be the exactly equivalent move, king d5. Both of these moves seem to produce exactly the same effect. But you cannot forget, as you see in the text box, that just because you are deep freezing your opponent's pawns, you cannot assume that there doesn't exist a pawn breakthrough. A pawn breakthrough can break through a deep freeze, and that's precisely what happens if you play the sloppy move king d6. Here, black can push a5, breaking through the deep freeze. And after ba5, b4, again, both pawns promote simultaneously, and it's a dead draw. b1, a8, b1 queen. White is a series of meaningless checks, but that's about it. Black easily saves the game. Incidentally, black also has the move f5 here, leading to a pawn race on the other side of the board. That is also a draw. So it is crucial to play king d5 and only king d5. The way that this works is that a5 is clearly no longer effective because after b4, white just stops the pawn with his king. And if black tries to strike at the other side, if black plays f5, then after gf5, king f6, you want to apply another rule of pawn races. This is the final rule, which says that you don't always have to participate in a pawn race. You're not signing a contract, and you don't have to go king c6. Here, you drop the king back to e4. You already have a passed pawn. That's all you need, and you win the game in very elementary fashion just by using pawn-assisted opposition to push the black king all the way to the back. And this is a great time to apply a concept that we also talked through in the advanced concepts in pawn endgames video, where you can play king g6 and win the pawn, but the easiest method is again to stalemate the black king, but you're not really stalemating black because black still has a5. And here after a7, b2, white promotes to a queen and simultaneously delivers checkmate. And that is the brilliant win, which Akiba Rubinstein actually missed in the game. He ended up dropping his king back in resignation, not literally in resignation, but this is a sign that he doesn't know what to do. He did have one more trick up his sleeve, though, and Paul Leonhardt really dropped the ball here. He made a series of terrible moves, starting with king f6. The easiest way to draw would have been to actually drop the king back to e8. And the idea is that if white tries to break through with g5, after hg5, king takes g5, now the king returns back to f7, and white is simply in Zugzwang. White has to drop the king back to g4. f6 is no longer effective. h6 actually loses the game after king f6. The white king gets shouldered. So this just ends the discussion. And if white plays king e5, we remember corresponding squares. Black steps into opposition, and the kings just start dancing around the board. White cannot make any progress. I won't delve into how the game continued. You can find that in the solutions PGN. Leonhardt played king f6. Now Rubinstein played g5 check. It's still a draw if black steps away to the right square. Leonhardt didn't do that, and he ended up losing a queen endgame. But the takeaway from this game is that you can use the concept of sacrificing your own pawns, moving your opponent's pawns in order to set yourself up successfully for a pawn race. Okay, on we go to the next example. Let's flip the board. Oop, let's not jump the gun here. Let me rewind back to the initial position. And as per usual, I'm going to change the text box here to reflect the third position. All right, I think this is kind of small. Let's make that a little bit bigger. There we go. And let's get back to the recording. All right, time for a sip of coffee. I suggest you do the same. These endgames are grueling. You can see we're only 2 games in, and we've already talked through like a wide range of concepts. Hope you've enjoyed the examples thus far. We're going to fast forward about 100 years to the 1990s. And what you see in front of you is a game between 2 very strong grandmasters, Evgeny Bareev, who incidentally now lives in Canada, where I'm currently recording from, and black is Judith Polgar, who needs absolutely no introduction. So we are playing black, right? You're facing Judith Polgar, and you're trying to win this endgame. As per usual, it's important to start with observations, right? Rather than just starting by calculating random lines, oftentimes if the pawn endgame is complex enough, you need to get like your bearings. You need to get a sense of what's going on the board. So what observations can we make? Well, the first thing that jumps out to me is the fact that white has a outside passer on a4. You might remember that an outside passer is just a pass pawn that is as far away from all of the other pawns as possible, right? Most of the pawns are on the king side. This pawn is on the A file. A passed pawn is, generally speaking, a great asset. And what makes it an even greater asset is if it is protected by another pawn. A protected outside passed pawn is often a massive trump card in pawn endgames, and it often wins you the game. And this pawn on A4 is indeed a protected outside passer. White can play B3 on demand to protect that pawn. What it does is it greatly limits the scope of Black's king. Black's king is kind of on a leash in the sense that it can move somewhat to the king side and then return to stop the A pawn, but it can't move too far. If it moves to the F file, then White is just going to start pushing his A pawn, and the king will not be able to stop it in time. Looking at the king side, the situation also does not appear encouraging for Black because the E pawn is deep freezing Black's E and F pawns. And although White does have damaged H pawns, they're kind of doing the job, and they're holding back Black's ostensibly healthier pawn formation as well. But these observations don't tell the whole story, because we have to notice one more thing. There's a pawn on E5, and that pawn is isolated, it is weak, and it cannot be defended either by a pawn or by a king. And so the only logical way for Black to start in this position is to shift the king up to D5. A tempting continuation would be to play C4 in order to try to slice off the A pawn from its cousin on B2. The problem is that this creates too big of a weakness on C4, and White's king, smelling blood, would move to D2, and then it would move, whatever you do, it would move to C3, and Black is just in zugzwang. Black has to slide her king over. White plays A5, and here the easiest way to win is via a method that we have discussed many times. If you have a passed pawn on one side of the board, you force your opponent's king to distract itself by taking that pawn. In the meantime, you go around and you take all of the pawns on the other side of the board. You don't need to push the B pawn. You can just leave it on B2. You can leave it as far away as possible from Black's king and just go king C5, king D6, and king E7, and you win. So C4 doesn't work. We have to start with king D5. Now, obviously, Bareev is not just going to let Polgar capture the pawn on E5. If White plays a move like B3, then Black captures on E5. And at this point, Black already gets connected passers on the king side, and Black wins pretty easily. So, of course, Bareev in this position automatically plays the move A5, which seems to be part of his split. He's pushing his passer. And what's important is that king takes E5 now fails to A6. Black's king is not in time by a tempo to stop the pawn. But that's exactly the point. Once the pawn reaches A5, it can no longer be protected by the B pawn. So the move king D5 essentially does what C4 does, except it doesn't create an additional pawn weakness. And now comes the sort of first brilliant part of Polgar's idea. She moves her king back to C6. Once again, you can consider this moving your opponent's pawns, or I would refer to it as inducing a weakness. You have forced the A pawn forward, and as you hopefully know by now, pushing pawns does not mean good, right? Those are not synonyms. Pushing your pawns in pawn endgames can actually be precisely what leads to your downfall, and now Black is poised to play king B5, win the pawn on A5, and then convert the endgame. But that's still not the end of the story, and you would be totally forgiven for assuming that this is already where the game is supposed to end. Yevgeny Bareev comes up with a devilish defensive concept. Plays king D3, Polgar plays king B5. Now he plays the move B3. King takes A5, king C4. Okay, king drops back to B6 to defend C5. This is all forced. And now Bareev slides his king back to D3. And he says, guess what? My pawn on E5 is controlling D6. My pawn on B3 is controlling A4. Black has no infiltration squares with her king. If Black plays king B5, White plays king C3, and Black is in zugzwang. Remember, we have to assess who has how many waiting moves. And here, both sides have 0 waiting moves. But that's more important for Black in this case, because that means that Black has to slide her king back from B5. Well, we can't make progress that way. Can we make progress the other way? Not really. It leads to the same exact thing. White plays king C4, covering the D5 square, and Black's king has no choice but to move back to B6. But this is where one particular troublesome concept comes into play. Without applying this concept, you cannot win this position, and that is the concept of triangulation. And there's a couple of related ideas that you have to fully understand in order to even come up with the idea of triangulating here. So triangulation is a process by which you kind of draw a triangle with your king with the aim of getting a particular position, a particular target position, with the other side to move. Now, what position do we want to get with White to move? Well, You can determine this by drawing up the corresponding squares. And I remind you that the corresponding squares are squares where, let's say white's king reaches a square, black's king has to reach a corresponding square in order to avoid Zugzwang. So if both sides are sitting on their corresponding squares, the side whose move it is in Zugzwang. So essentially, you want to hit your corresponding square after your opponent hits their corresponding square. So that might be a bunch of gibberish to you, although hopefully you kind of understand a little bit more after the last video. What are the corresponding squares here? Well, there's basically two sets. There's the squares b5 and c3. Let's draw that in green. And then there's c6 and c4. So if black's king reaches b5, white's king wants to step on c3, but not in the other order. If it was white to move here, white would have to move his king away from c3, allowing black's king to infiltrate b4. Then black would push c4, mowing the lawn, by the way, and clearing a pathway to the e5 pawn. The same exact thing goes for the other set of corresponding squares. If black plays king c6, white wants to be the one to step to c4. So essentially, black wants either this position or this position, but with white to move. And this is where triangulation comes to the rescue. Rather than playing king c6, you step back to c7. White cannot step onto c4 because then black hits the corresponding square second. That's what we want. White has to toggle between c3 and d3, waiting until black gets to c6. But now the triangulation continues with king b7. Again, white has no choice but to play king d3. Bareev, by the way, resigned in this position. He already knew what was coming. But after king d3, we complete the triangulation with king b6. Observe the pattern that black's king has taken in the last couple of moves. It's gone from b6 to c7 to b7 to b6, and that is just a pure triangulation maneuver. And all of a sudden, white is busted, because white has to step onto one of his corresponding squares first, either king c4, king c6, and black wins, or white has to play king c3, that's another corresponding square, black plays king b5. The whole point is that if white tries to circumvent that with king c2, the pawn on e5 being weak is what costs white the game. Black plays king c6 and reaches d5 in time. So triangulation often isn't possible without these like additional weaknesses that take away certain waiting moves from your opponent's king. And this is a case in point. The pawn on e5 being weak means that white always has to keep his king in close proximity to the c4 square, and it can't step back to c2. Black's king just has more real estate to maneuver on, and that's what triangulation ultimately works. Bareev, he resigned after king b7. If king c4, then king c6. If king t3, then not king c6, but king b6, forcing white to occupy one of the mined squares. The king slides up to b5, and after king c2, king b4, king b2, a simple instantiation, but still very much an instance of mowing the lawn. You want to clear the pathway to the center, and so you play the move c4, takes, and I don't really have to show any more. Black wins the pawn on e5 and easily converts the two extra pawns. So I already forgot what I wrote in the text box. So the theme, inducing weaknesses, triangulation. There's obviously more themes than that, but again, this is just a good rough outline to help you contextualize, file this away in your mental Rolodex. So the tips are: you can use your king to provoke a weakness by forcing your opponent to unchain their pawns or move a pawn forward. Construct the target positions you're trying to achieve and whose side to move before triangulation. So what this really means is that you should be aware of what the corresponding squares are, and you want to know, whose move you want it to be in a particular kind of position. Okay, hopefully this helps clear up triangulation just a little bit. All right, again, I made the mistake of fast forwarding through the solution there, but it's time for exercise number 4. All right, we've been going for about 30 minutes, so pretty happy with the timing thus far. I don't want this video to be too long. That's why I'm breaking it up into 2. If we did 10 puzzles, that would have just been totally crazy. Okay, let's make this a little bit bigger. So the next example, we talk about inducing weaknesses once again, and we talk about opposition. And I really, really love this example. I think this will really help you understand an important aspect of dealing with pawn races and king races. This is just a lovely, lovely sequence. So it's 2 guys named Lajos, 2 Hungarian players, but the guy playing black is a lot more famous, Lajos Portisch. He's still alive. One of the leading grandmasters in the world in the 50s and 60s. His opponent, just a experienced Hungarian master. And what's interesting is that Portisch wrote a book on endgames called 600 Endgames. Very not a popular book at all, but I had it. And that was, I think, the first endgame book that I worked through with my coach. It was like 600 instructive endgame positions. There was no text; they were just moves, and it really ignited my love for endgame. So this is a little bit of my paying the respects back to Lajos Portisch, considering one of his lovely endgame wins. So okay. So we have clearly a situation where both kings are running toward the opposing set of pawns and trying to capture as many of them as possible. So we examined an example like this in the last video, where we mentioned that it's important not to just assume that in such positions the only thing that you can do is walk your king toward the enemy pawns. You can also use your pawns to modify the pawn structure to create a better situation for your king. So obviously the first thing that you should calculate is king e4. What happens if black reaches white's pawns? And it seems like black must be winning here. Black is so much faster, so much closer to white's pawns than white's king. But the problem is that after f5, white has built a pawn chain, and it takes an additional 2 moves for black to reach the base of that pawn chain. In the meantime, white has 2 moves to reach e7, and because black's pawn structure is so much less sound and so much weaker, it turns out that white is able to hold the draw. After king d7, king f3, king d7, king g3, king d7, king takes h3, nothing else that black can do. White has to take the correct pawn here. And if you didn't reach this position in your solution, I would encourage you to pause the video and try to figure out which pawn white should take. Now, you can consider this a kind of illustration of charting a course where you don't just want to grab a random pawn. You want to actually evaluate both options. And if you do so, you will see that king takes f6 is a grave error, because after king takes g4, you're in Zugzwang. You can't capture the f7 pawn without giving up f5. Now the kings are in opposition, and black just runs the h pawn up the board. So you want to do it in the opposite order. You want to take f7 first. Then after king takes g4, you take f6, simultaneously defending f5, and it's not hard to calculate that the pawn race results in a draw. King g6, h4, blah, blah, blah. h2, f8 queen, h1 queen, and black is really the one who gets lucky here, because queen f5 check almost wins the queen. It just so happens that black has the g3 square, right? And we talked about these scenarios a lot, where the king is on the g file and the queen is on the h file. You cannot just assume that these situations are always a draw. Okay, so let's rewind all the way back to the initial position, right? We have considered king e4, king e3 results in the same sequence. And we have to realize that even though black's pawns are incredibly ruined, one of the interesting properties of pawn endgames is that doubled pawns are often an asset. The reason is that you can sacrifice the first of these doubled pawns, and you still avoid a situation where you gift your opponent a passed pawn, right? Normally, if you give away a pawn that's on a file, and your opponent captures it, they have now have a passed pawn. Not so when your pawns are doubled. And so you can use that interesting feature and play the move f6, f5. Again, this is a form of inducing weaknesses in white's pawn structure. So what specifically does this move do? Well, this invites white to take on f5, and it shifts white's pawns to more capturable squares. Here, after king e4, black is already ready to take both of these pawns. If white plays f6, we get a very interesting sequence. King takes f4, king d7, king f5, king e7, king g6. We talked about this scenario. What do we look for in such a scenario? Well, we look at the waiting moves. Which side can exhaust their waiting moves last? And it's not hard to determine that that side is us. It is black. White has only one waiting move, and now black calibrates his waiting moves based on where white's pawn is. We play h5. We dislodge the king from e7, capture f6, and win the game. So here, waiting moves come into play. Now, white doesn't have to play f6. White can also directly head for black's pawns, king d7. And now black has the same choice that white had in that other line. Which pawn should black capture? Well, the answer is f5. If instead black captures f4, then white draws in relatively elementary fashion with king e7, king takes f5, king takes f7, and if black tries to run up to the h pawn, then white is just going to draw For example, with king e6, and after king g3, king f5, white reaches the promised land, whatever black does. If black takes, and king g5 and king h6 draws, and if black plays h5, a keen knowledge of theoretical endgames is required here. White doubles back to e4 and then locks in the king with king f3. We talked about this scenario in like a more complicated version. This, of course, is a very famous draw because black can make absolutely zero progress. Corner pawns are just totally lame in these kinds of situations. So the correct pawn to take is actually f5. And after king e7, the final critical moment of this game arises. This actually happened in the game. Again, if black just merely takes the pawn on f4, then white recaptures on f7, and it's a draw. King g3 may look like it wins, but again, white has this trick, king f6. And if black plays king takes h3, white goes king g5 and doubles back to h6. And if black plays h5, then it's very important for white to be accurate. Pause the video, figure out where white's king should go. So the correct answer is king e5 or king f5. And this is a very worthwhile position to know. If h4, then king e4 and king f3 leads to a position we've already seen. If king takes h3, it seems like white's king isn't able to reach f3 in time, but that's an illusion. White plays king f4. Sear this position into your memory. Remember this one. It's worthwhile. This is a draw because black cannot do two things at once, right? Black wants to play h4 and king g2 both, but he can't play them at the same time. And if you play h4, you allow king f3. If you play king g2, then the distance between the king and the pawn grows too large, and white is able to pick the pawn off with his own king with the move king g5. And these lines, of course, are very difficult to calculate in your head, especially if you've forced yourself to calculate without moving the pieces. But that's just what you got to deal with in pawn endgame. So what, is this a draw? Well, as it turns out, it is not a draw. And here we have to turn to one of the tips that I shared. If your king dominates its counterpart, apply PPP, push your prospective passer before eliminating your opponent's pawns. In pawn endgames, you can reverse the order of the stuff that you do. If you need to take your opponent's pawns and then push your own pawn, you should often consider what happens if you push your pawn first and only then take your opponent's pawns. You might assume that, well, that this is commutative, like, oh, if you do the one thing, it's going to be the same. That's not how chess works. And the reason that's not how chess works is because that's not how king placement works, right? If you keep your king on a certain square, you might disallow or you might stop your opponent from making the moves that he otherwise would have been able to make. And this is a great illustration of that. The winning move, the only winning move, is h5. And after king takes f7, the only winning move, again, not king takes f4, but rather h4. You push the prospective passer first. You get that out of the way. And what you can see is that the kings are in opposition. Why is that important? Well, that's important because it prevents white from heading back to the sixth rank. White, in effect, just has to waste a move by playing king e7. Now black takes on f4, and black has gained a tempo, pushing the pawn up to h4, and doing one of the tasks that black was supposed to do in one of the drawn position, right? We were discussing that black has two things he wants to do and only one move to do them. Here, all black needs to do is take on h3, and that is a task black can succeed with in time. King f6, king g3, and white is not in time. We had this exact position, but the pawn was on h5. Now it's on h4, and black wins tempo for tempo with the move king g2. And on the next move, the red carpet is unrolled and black promotes the h-pawn. So this one is really just a brilliant illustration of so many different concepts. You start with the move f5, inducing weaknesses in white's pawn camp. You don't automatically move your king to where the enemy pawns are. You realize that you can use your pawns as a weapon, especially if you have doubled pawns. There's a nice sort of mini application of waiting moves. That is, if white takes and then plays f6, we go for the what's called the trebuchet position. I want to thank people in the chat and the comments for telling me that this situation with the kings on g6 and e7 like this is called a trebuchet, and just in general the comments have been phenomenal. So just a huge shout out to everybody who's engaging with these videos and leaving these unbelievably generous comments. It warms my heart, and that's why I'm so motivated to do these videos. So wasn't planning to gush like halfway through the video, but really thank you, and thank you for enlightening me on certain things that I still have yet to learn. I have plenty to learn in pawn endgames. Don't get me wrong. Um, so there's the waiting move idea that white is only one and black has two, and there's also the notion of pushing your prospective passer, right? Not rushing to take the pawn on f4. That's the overarching theme of this game. Not rushing to capture pawns, but oftentimes moving your own prospective passer first beforehand and keeping the kings in opposition. Brilliant win by Lajos Portisch. He found all of this and he won in convincing fashion. Last really quick thing. If white plays king d7 here and doesn't take on f5, then that makes things easy. King e4, king e7, and now f takes g4, h takes g4, king takes f4. This is pretty easy to establish here. Look at how the h pawn is like covering the g6 square, and the path to promotion is clear. Okay, on we go to our final and perhaps most exciting example. I see that we are about 40 minutes into the video. That's perfect time. That's exactly how I had planned it. So hopefully the pace has not been too frenetic. And if it has, remember that you can download the solutions database in the description, and you can view it at your leisure. Ooh, I think I might have cut off part of the. Ooh, I think I just scroll down like this. And now let's move this back up. There's going to be a lot to get through in this example. I'm going to cut off part of the camera, which is probably a good thing anyway because of the quality. So you can see that there are a ton of themes attendant to this example. This is another simul game, but it's no longer Jose Raul Capablanca. This time it's Vasily Smyslov on the white side of the game and Mike Dyslin on the black side. I would imagine rated somewhere around master level. He was not rated at the time this game was played. And man, these people playing simuls are tough. We saw Capablanca going down in flames. Now we see Smyslov not quite going down in flames, but failing to spot a brilliant win in this position that's in front of you. And yes, white is in check. The question is obviously, how should white react to the check? Black's last move was f6 takes g5 check. Okay, so if you haven't seen any of the pawn endgame videos, then the most natural reaction to someone, for someone who's not experienced in pawn endgames would be, well, what kind of psycho would not take the pawn on g5? This is a dumb question. Obviously, the first move is king takes g5. Why are you asking me that? Well, if you have watched the videos carefully, and as a more experienced student of pawn endgames, you will be able to inform that person that, wait a second, in pawn endgames, it's often about whose move it is. Moreover, oftentimes the side that has the move has a disadvantage. That is known as Zugzwang, and Zugzwang is a ridiculously common concept in pawn endgames. In fact, there's no other type of endgame where Zugzwang is as ubiquitous and as important of a weapon as in pawn endgame. So getting the same position with the other side to move is often the path to victory. And that is precisely what Smyslov, playing a simul, playing on a lot of boards, failed to appreciate. He grabs the pawn on g5. And Mike Dyslin is able to draw the game after e takes d4. Now again, we have a situation that should be familiar to you, where both kings are kind of vying for position on the king side. And neither king wants to move. White's king most certainly does not want to move back. Black's king most certainly does not want to move back and allow White's king to step forward. And so we turn to the waiting moves. We play the waiting move game. Who has more waiting moves? Well, the problem is that White has to start first. White has two waiting moves, and so does black, and so the waiting moves cancel each other out. A3, you know the drill. A6, not A5, because after A4, white wins, and here a beautiful application of mowing the lawn. King G6, King F8. How does white clear the path to the weak B6 pawn? Well, you already know the drill. White plays F6, trading off the final blade of grass on the king side, takes, and white just walks over and wins the b6 pawn. Notice that there is no breakthrough here because there's a c pawn that's guarding the b5 square. And again, white benefits from having doubled c pawns. So instead, Dyslin correctly plays a6, a4, only now black plays a5, and white is the one in Zugzwang. He has to drop the king back to g4, and black can draw this in a variety of ways. As it turns out, even king f6 draws. I mean, here after king f4, it may seem like black is in Zugzwang, but actually he's not. King e7, white plays king e5. Congrats, you have the opposition. But remember, opposition is not a panacea. Black slides over to f7, and we're at a dead end. Because if we head for d6, we lose the f pawn, and black promotes in way too early. Black wins, and white cannot make any progress. Like, in this case, it doesn't even matter who has the opposition. Black can go wherever the heck he wants, except f7. This is what you want to avoid, because here white gets to g6. All you want to avoid is the corresponding squares, g5 and f7. That is, you want to make sure that you step onto f7 only when white steps onto g5. Those are the only mined squares. As long as you avoid f7 until white's king is on g5, you're good. So that's how the game ended. The game ended in a draw. Now, when you're looking at these lines, the first thing that should by now come to mind is, well, let's get the same position with black to move. Let's get black to be the one to exhaust his waiting moves first. And that is why you should come up with the brilliant move, king g4. I love this move. This is just why pawn endgames are so beautiful. This is the only winning move. Okay, king h5 is also winning, but it's exactly the same thing. So the point is that after e takes d4, king takes g5, it is now black to play. And if we go through the same line, a6, a3, a5, a4, it's now black to move. The kings stand on the corresponding squares, and black loses to king f6, king g6, king f8, king g6, and then f6. We know the drill. But that's not the end of the story. And it's very important when you're assessing waiting moves to really exhaustively assess all of your opponent's possible pawn moves. If you look at this position carefully, you'll notice that black also has the move b5. And this is actually a really, really annoying move, because after the trade, it turns out that white is all of a sudden out of waiting moves, right? White is the one who has exhausted his final waiting move, and we kind of know the drill. The kings just start dancing around the f5 and g7 pawns. Except this is where the second critical concept of this game comes in. Anytime there's a transformation of the pawn structure, you have to sort of reassess the situation, because in trading a pair of pawns, your opponent may have inadvertently or unwittingly weakened his or her pawn structure on the side of the board where the trade occurred. So that may have blazed new trails or new pathways for your king, and that is precisely what happens here. In this situation, right, black's pawns are all defending each other. But once b5 is played, we saw an example like this in the previous video, the pawn on c5 is suddenly a huge weakness, and white can use this fact to initiate a advantageous pawn race. But it's important to do it in a very particular way. There are some mined squares. In particular, f4 and f6 are actually corresponding squares. If you play king f4 and you rush toward d5, you forfeit the win. Black plays king f6. Now you might say, well, I go king e4 and I push black's king back, but except you don't. Black goes to g5 and keeps himself anchored to the f5 pawn. This is where I remind you that shouldering is only good with respect to the other pawn, right? Congratulations, here you have shouldered black's king technically, but black's king remains pegged to the f5 pawn, disallowing white from moving the king to d5. You can convince yourself of this, but the pawn race is losing for white. By the way, nice application of a pawn race rule. In fact, I have two pawn race rules here. This is why I chose these examples. You have these random lines where you just incidentally see other rules being applied. So the first rule you have to remember is to use your king to block your opponent's king from stopping your pawns. That's why g4 would be a terrible move due to king e3. You have to play king f4. The other rule is to identify the checking zone of both pawns. That will help you see if a pawn happens to promote with check, which can change the outcome of a pawn race. That is precisely what happens here. White rushes the pawn to c4, g4, c5, g3. Actually, white can play cb, and you might say, hey, white's going to promote with check, but black promotes first, and the white king happens to be in the checking zone of black's queen. Black promotes with check and then easily stops white's pawns. Just an amazing line, where white only loses by the skin of his teeth, but still loses. And if white goes f6 and tries to eliminate the pawns, then again white loses, because black's king is a lot closer to the c2 pawn, and black's pawns are just better positioned to benefit in the ensuing pawn race. You can convince yourself of this on your own. So amazingly, the natural king f4 steps onto a mined square. You have to go through g4. You have to once again perform triangulation. If black steps onto f6, Then white plays king f4, putting black in Zugzwang. Black now does have to step back, and white steps forward to e5. If black plays c4, then it's really easy. You take and you play a4, and then you promote the a pawn. Your king is close enough to black's pawns. You might notice the easy breakthrough, but white has king e3, and the pawn is comfortably stopped. So here black is in Zugzwang. Black is going to say, well, I'm not stepping onto f6. I'm also going to start dancing. But this is the kind of scenario that we saw in the Bareev Polgar game, where what white has to do is just circumvent the f4 square, right? White plays king f3, triangulation, king f7. Black just has to toggle between these two squares. Black plays king d6, then Zugzwang arrives even faster. White plays king e4. And here the shouldering actually works because black is getting shouldered with respect to these pawns, and these pawns are incredibly vulnerable. King b6, you can actually go either king d5 or even king e6 and king f7, and here white wins the race. So this doesn't work. Black has to go king f7, and now you go through e4. And this is the brilliance of white's strategy. Black has a losing ultimatum. If black doesn't play king f6 and black plays king e7, then we infiltrate to d5. We will examine this scenario in a second. If black plays king f6, then we double back to f4, hitting our target position with black to move. And finally, black is in Zugzwang. And finally, we get access to black's queenside pawns. And even this is not the end of the story. King f6, king takes c5. You have to evaluate the pawn race. After king takes f5, the amazing thing is that the white king captures on d4. And you might say, well, wait a second, didn't we just have this position? Didn't we determine that black is winning? No, no, no. We had this position with black to move. And with black to, sorry, we had this position with a pawn already on g5. That extra tempo results in a win for black. But with white's move, you have the mirror image on the other side. Black's king is now in the checking zone of the c4 pawn. If black plays g5, then after cb, it is no longer black who promotes with check. It is white who promotes with check. Now you might say, but wait a second. Black is going to take on c4 first. And after dcg5, the white pawn, the black king, is no longer in the checking zone of white's pawn. But here you perform a technique that we also covered in the pawn race video. You slide your king back to d3. What you're doing is you're forcing black's king further and further into the board. And what does this move do? Well, let's think about what this move does. Well, what this move does is it puts the king in opposition to white's king. And now you have to reassess the pawn race. It also takes the white king away from the checking zone of the black pawn, which means that now the pawns promote simultaneously, and it's now white to move. And by now you should be totally primed to look for ways to engage a favorable queen trade. You should identify this scenario from 10 miles away. If you're black, you should try not to touch this with a 10-foot pole, because after queen f5 and queen g5, you know the drill by now so very well. You trade queens, and we have exactly one passed pawn left, and that passed pawn decides the game. This is just a mind-blowing line to me because of just how many concepts it illustrates in one. And after bc, dc, g5, king d3, if black tries to go the other way, it is worth remembering that two pawns that are on adjacent files are self-sufficient. I talked about this in the passed pawn video. What you want to do here is play a4. And if black goes after one pawn, you push the other one. Again, if you're not familiar with this, consult that video, rewatch it. If black goes around and says, now let me get to the a5 pawn, the moment the king reaches b7, white plays c5. And whichever way black goes, white pushes the respective other pawn. And black will never be able to take one of the pawns without allowing the other one to promote. In the meantime, white is just going to step up, take the g pawn, and then walk the king over to assist these two heroes on the CNA file. So we need to rewind all the way back here, all the way back, just to recap what we just did in this position. So actually, let's go back to the start. It all started with us understanding that we need to get this position with black to move because we need black to start exhausting his waiting moves first. So we force black to play a6. And if black plays a5, then it's all very easy. We mow the lawn, we play f6, and we get to the b pawn, right? That's straightforward. But black can play the move b5. Now, we don't forget that when pawns are traded, you have to reassess the pawn structure. You have actually induced a weakness. That weakness is c5. But the way you want to approach that weakness is not by stepping onto a line square and allowing black's king to reach the king side, clinging to the f pawn. You want to triangulate. You go king g3, then king f3. And you can call this triangulation, but in a sense, this is almost like circumventing a mined square. This is a fundamentally different concept where you're still reaching your destination. You're just not driving onto the, there's a road with a bunch of cops on it. There's a closed road, just not driving onto that road, right? You're avoiding the 101 freeway in San Francisco. Fortunately, there's no way to avoid it. I hate the 101 freeway. So you're just avoiding the mined square. You go king e4, and as soon as black steps onto his corresponding square, whoop, we slide back to f4, inducing the target position of the Zugzwang. And then it's still not the end of the story. In the pawn race, white uses a bunch of techniques to get black's king onto the maximally vulnerable position after g5, c4. Black's king is in the checking zone. And after bc-dc, black's king is dragged back to f3 using the rule that says you should help in a pawn race by dragging your opponent's king onto the least desirable square by threatening to stop your opponent's pawn with your own king. And then you use what we started with. These concepts, they've come full circle. Remember the Capablanca game? We had a very similar idea. There, you had to assess an entirely new pawn endgame. Here, it's much easier because you have a passed a pawn. How Smyslov didn't find this in a simul game, I do not know. I'm kidding, of course. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes our whirlwind tour of these 5 exercises. These are, once again, this is the first set. There will be a second video with 5 more exercises, and those will cover the themes that we have not touched upon as frequently today. Now, remember, this isn't about, I'm giving equal coverage to every single concept. There will be concepts that we don't necessarily directly talk about, while there are other concepts like pawn races that I'm talking about very frequently, and that is because of how important I think they are. And hopefully you found the exercises stimulating. Hopefully you found them somewhat interesting. And I just want to repeat what I started with, which is that even if you decided not to solve these exercises, or if you tried to solve them but couldn't, that doesn't mean that that you suck or that you didn't appreciate the videos. These were supposed to be incredibly challenging and stimulating, and these were supposed to further your understanding rather than undermine it. So don't worry, don't be too harsh on yourself. But feel free to consult the Solutions PGN if you want to review stuff and you want to revisit all of these beautiful variations. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have found the audio to be tolerable. Thank you so much for watching and for all of the super wholesome feedback, and I will see you in the next puzzle solving video.